So I went receivers early and I went receivers late. Maybe you noticed this, Nick, because I know that you ended up with I'm just checking your roster right now. I'm correct me if I'm wrong. You were looking to target some rookie receivers as well, but ultimately the draft board didn't quite shake out the way that you did, because ultimately I saw a ton of value, at least taking one, maybe two of the top rookie receivers, meaning first rounders in the NFL draft.
Yeah, man, I was eyeing Marvin Harrison Jr. and Rome Odunze,
Mm-hmm.
and those guys went off the board. But with Odunze, I was saying, okay, listen, I already have DJ Moore, already have DeAndre Swift,
Yeah.
and I think when you look at the fact of those three guys, week 7, they would have buys. And I was thinking strategically that would put me in somewhat of a bind with those guys on buys. And the way that the draft was falling, there was not a lot of value that I can pick up at that time. So what I opted to do was I said, okay, well, with Sam Darnold being in Minnesota and you got Justin Jefferson being that main guy, the other guy opposite him is going to get some touches too.
Right.
And it was Jordan Addison. Right. So that's why I picked up Jordan Addison. And that's okay. Well, listen, if we're looking at the idea of Kansas City and wanting to get a piece of that Kansas City offense, well, they just acquired a guy in Hollywood Brown to be the Tyreek Hill for 2024 and beyond. So, well, he's injured this game. I sit him for the extent of his injury. And then later on, I could plug him into, the offense. But here's the other thing, too. I had to strategically think about acquiring guys who would give me excellent trade value later on.
Okay.
Like normally I wouldn't get 2 tight ends on my team. I would just stream the tight ends. But I said, well, let me get Ingram and let me go get Dallas Goedert. Why Dallas Goedert? Because when you look at the Philadelphia's offense, Dallas Goedert is still going to be an intricate part of what they do. And if he starts to put up numbers, once again, I get trade value. What are you willing to give me if you are in need of a tight end? Because there are not too many great tight ends after you go from Ingram to LaPorta, TJ Hawkinson, who's injured. You have Mandrews, right?
Yeah.
Then you have to go to your second tier with guys like Isaiah Likely. There's not a lot of tight ends out there. I mean, you can even, Pat Fryermuth was one of those guys who I looked at as well. But I say, well, looking at the framework of the offense, who is going to be a more reliable, 5 down, like 5 yard pick up for the quarterback? And I was like, Dallas Goedert was going to be like that. So it's about drafting with the idea of moving pieces around and later on in the season having draft capital. I mean, trade.
And what you're identifying too, even with the example of Dallas Goedert, but you mentioned Hollywood Brown and Rome Odunze. For me, I ended up with both of them among my leagues in particular because they were being drafted as the third pass catcher in what we understand to be great offenses. We know with the Kansas City Chiefs, we believe with the Chicago Bears that they can get there. Can they keep 3 guys all fed with targets? Is Rome Odunze going to come out of the gate earning more targets than DJ Moore and Keenan Allen? Probably not. But the rapport that he had with Caleb Williams early on, pre-draft workouts together, they fly together to Chicago, and knowing that the Bears picked up Keenan Allen, not expecting Rome Odunze to be there at 9th overall. So I'm willing to take a bet when it was the 75th pick overall with Keenan Allen and DJ Moore well off the board, thinking that, hey, their connection, their rapport is something that could work together. And with Hollywood Brown, the shoulder injury, that made his draft stock plummet. I think more often than not, I'd see Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy get drafted kind of early. But I loved the value in Rome Odunze, Brian Thomas Jr. with the Jaguars, who's going to be competing with your Evan Ingram for targets there in Jacksonville. But there just seemed like a whole lot of opportunity for me to take those rookies in the middle to late rounds rather than spending my last overall pick on A.D. Mitchell or Keon Coleman or, no disrespect to those guys, but by paying a couple rounds more expensive, these are my wide receiver 4s, 5s. I'm not expecting them to produce for me right away, but I know that I can at least rely on elite talent that was identified by multiple front offices that made them worthy of a first round selection. And look, draft capital is bunk, right? Teams make mistakes all the time.
Right.
But at the same time, Brian Thomas, who's getting drafted outside of the top 100, just led all of college football with receiving touchdowns last year. I'll take that risk. That's a calculated bet that I'm willing to do. And because I had such an emphasis on wide receivers, I'm also taking a lot of bets on split backfields, right? Without knowing who the lead guy is, right? Was I, in love with Braylon Allen? Yes, until he was drafted by the Jets, knowing that he'd be behind Breece Hall. I need to understand the situation that certain running backs are being put into, and not just rookies, right? When you have big seismic shifts with either free agency or how a roster is overall constructed, that sort of helps me figure out what it is that I want to do. I have a league, I wanted to identify the Cincinnati Bengals and Dallas Cowboys in particular. I've got one league with Zach Moss and Rico Dowdle. I've got another league with Chase Brown, right? I'm fortunate enough to be able to spread the chips around, but at the same time, Nick, I want to target good offenses that have a history of relying on running the football and knowing that I'm not competing with I'm not drafting Tyler Algier because, yes, he's going to get work, but unless there's an injury to Bijan Robinson, he's never going to be a featured guy. You never know in a backfield with Zach Moss and Chase Brown or Rico Dowdle and Ezekiel Elliott, which one of them could take over, right? So, in identifying the running backs that I wanted to use or at least take a shot on, they may not be starting for me, but it's all, entirely possible that we could see a breakout candidate like a Kyron Williams last year, who was going undrafted compared to Cam Akers, who we were, sure solidified that top job and yet was still a 6th, 7th round pick in your fantasy drafts in 2023.
That was the conundrum I was dealing with when looking at the Detroit Lions backfield and whether to draft Jahmyr Gibbs or David Montgomery. We know that they split the bulk of the carries in an offense, and you look at Jahmyr Gibbs as being more of the speedy and athletic of the two, but you knew that they're going to split carries. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to get either of those two guys. That's why I settled on DeAndre Swift, who's in Chicago, who in his own right is one hell of a running back, and having a rookie quarterback in Caleb Williams. My theory was, okay, we saw DeAndre Swift with the Philadelphia Eagles. We also saw him a little in training camp in the preseason with the Chicago Bears. We know that he does a great job catching the ball out of the backfield, and that was the thing that was on my mind. Yeah, you want carries, but it's about touches and it's about targets. So just getting a guy in a run-heavy offense that you figure that the quarterback is going to turn around and hand it off to him, hey, man, that's great. But I also want a back who has versatility where I know that, hey, he's going to be involved in the passing game. He's going to be involved in the screen game as well. So once again, in those PPR leagues, the volume is going to be there. And that's what I was thinking about. But more importantly, what happens inside the red zone? Is this a team that's going to look to throw the ball inside the red zone opposed to handing it off? That was kind of a determining factor in me selecting certain players who were available to me when I had the opportunity to choose.
Yards are great, but touchdowns are what win you games. And the league where I have DeAndre Swift, it was, again, I started my draft receiver, 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 receiver. I went four. Let me rephrase. I went three receivers, quarterback, and another receiver. I could start up to 4 receivers, so I thought that was my strategy in a PPR. But at the same time, I feel like I settled on DeAndre Swift. And maybe this is one of the polarizing players that we get to disagree on all year, because I invested in the talent, knowing that when they get to the red zone in Detroit, there is a reason why Jamal Williams led the league in rushing touchdowns for a season. There's a reason why he was shifted out of that offense in Philadelphia. DeAndre Swift, while being a highly sought-out commodity and one of the first signed players in all of free agency to Chicago, he's always been a split backfield guy. And no running back other than Christian McCaffrey in 2024 is going to carry 100% of the work, but I am worried about the ceiling.